The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. I opened last week's show with a report on how the TV show Saturday Night Live interpreted a distressing near-death experience. The show intended it to be funny, of course, and actually it was, but a real dNDE is anything but funny and can, in fact, be terrifying. Our guest today is very probably the world's leading authority on dNDE's. She is the author of a key book on the subject titled Dancing Past the Dark, and she's about to come out with a follow-up book, which I'll be asking her about during the show. Nancy Evans Bush has been affiliated with IANDS since 1982, first as the executive director, then as a long-term board member and president, and now she's a leading researcher, writer, and blogger on distressing NDEs. Nancy was our first guest, actually, on our second program back in September 16th of 2013. And again, on June 29th, 2015, those shows are both available if you push the past shows button on the NDE Radio website. And you might want to do that, especially with the second program, because it's on that program she describes her own distressing near-death experience. So I hope you'll listen to them again when you get a chance. Nancy, welcome back to NDE Radio.
Well, Lee, it's always good to be back.
Nancy, on last week's show, I started off trying to discuss dNDE's, and then I got sidetracked onto a discussion of love and reciprocity, how God's love for us needs to be met by our love for Him, and all that importance that we practice on this earth, loving God. So anyway, I'm glad you're here today to keep me on track about dNDE's.
And I think still talking about a loving God.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Nancy, you've estimated that perhaps 20% of NDEs can be distressing. And that is ranging from a fear of the unknown to a frightening experience of the void to an experience that is truly hellish. Do you suppose these NDEs, or all NDEs for that matter, are individually designed to teach the experiencer about themselves?
I certainly prefer that interpretation to the idea that God is just waiting to whale us all for even the most minor transgression. I know that traditionally these types of experience have been interpreted as being punishment for sin, but it is equally valid to look at them the way the ancients did before the medieval description of hell. And the way the ancients interpreted them was as challenges. If you think of the heroes of ancient adventures, what happens is often a voyage to the underworld where they meet with terrible dragons and monsters and weird things that come out of the deeps. And the whole point is to meet and vanquish these, whether they're physical monsters or dangers. And then usually the hero would be awarded a prize. We've got golden apples, we've got golden fleeces, but there is a prize, there's a boon to be won, which the hero then takes back with him into the world because now he has special knowledge and can be helpful to his community. Well, we kept the monsters, we kept the fears, but we forgot about the gift. We've just dropped that completely as a culture. And I would like to see us get that back. And the gift is, generally speaking, some deep understanding about ourselves.
Yes. Well, there's certainly people that come back from NDEs with gifts, some of prophecy, some of healing, all the things that actually get mentioned in the Bibles as possible gifts from the Holy Spirit. You mentioned the ancients, and I immediately thought of Plato's story of the soldier and his experience was that after they crossed a field, they were judged and went into a sort of temporary, either heaven or a place of punishment. But it was only temporary, and afterwards the people that had been rewarded and the people who'd been punished all got together and talked about their experience before they were reincarnated. Do you see any validity in that picture of what happens when we die?
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. As deeply as it pains me to have to keep saying this to audiences, the medieval Christian view of hell is the only punishment in any of the world's religions that says the punishment is eternal. In other traditions, first of all, if we look at the Jewish tradition pre-Christian times, punishment for thousands of years. There was a sense that the dead, good and bad, simply went to a place underground, Sheol. But that wasn't a place of punishment. It was simply, hey, this is where the dead hang out. It was like a warehouse. And the idea of punishment crept in much later. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Good. I heard a series of beeps and then silence, and I was thinking, oh dear, we've lost each other, but here we are.
No. I have that experience sometimes myself, but no, we're still here. There is a path that I wanted to ask you about. You know, the Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yeah.
It suggests that we should all be having a temporary dNDE when we cross over, because they describe a place you traverse that has demons and temptations and distractions that are going to keep you from going into the light. And yet most of the people that have NDEs, the 80%, seem to go almost immediately into a good place.
Yeah, there is so much about these experiences that we don't know. There are people that sometimes have difficulty with the whole idea of near-death experiences, because even with the beautiful ones, people don't always describe the same place. So how can they be going to call it whatever if they're all different? So for some folks, this is a real roadblock. How come some people, good people, saints, Teresa of Avila, for one, Joan of Arc, for another, saints have terribly difficult experiences? Why is that if they're good people? The title of my forthcoming book is about the Buddha in hell. How can the Buddha be in hell? That just makes no sense. So, for the idea that there is a kind of sorting place makes logical sense. On the other hand, what if some of these experiences aren't about an afterlife? What if they're about now?
I had a guest on one time that described this, her near-death experience as going to a beautiful place with a guide. And she said, I happened to notice, I looked back, we were walking through a field, I think it was a field. And she said, as I looked back, I realized that the scene that I was seeing was disappearing behind me. And so I asked my guide about that. And the guide told me that this, what you're perceiving has been created especially for you.
Oh, doesn't that make sense?
I thought so. I thought that was really intriguing because of the differences we see in NDEs.
The whole idea that one size fits all, one place fits all, that there's only a single script and you just stumble into the script and have to follow the same thing. That doesn't really fit with what we know about consciousness and individuality and about growth. That's a wonderful way of putting it.
So if that's the case, then perhaps it's because it's known in advance that you're going to be going back. Perhaps this is a picture of something that you should see before you die rather than something that you would see after you die.
Well, I certainly like to think that they can be any of these, the good experiences, the difficult ones, can all be seen as having utility, even though it may be hard won to figure out what does this mean, but that it means something for our conscious living lives now, here. How can I keep learning and growing and getting more towards my goal of being the person I want to be? How can I do that if I have to die to get there?
Exactly.
So, one of the things that I'm going to forget if I don't say it was in my mouth. That is about that sorting room. If people have the dNDE's take a long time typically for people to sort them out, because we've been so culturally trained to think of this as hell, punishment, damnation, torment, that people go into a kind of PTSD terror and don't even want to think about them, thereby losing the challenge and losing whatever the gift is. But what about people who have a terrifying near death, close to death? If we don't talk about these things, if we don't really hash out what is a terrifying experience, how does it work, what might it mean, does it mean you're going to hell? Excuse me. If the experience happens close to death, there is inadequate processing time.
Yes.
So part of the premise of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for instance, is to prepare people. If this happens, if you see, if these are the experiences you have, then here is how to behave. Here is the light to look for. You don't want the little green one, you want the big white one. And that seems to me to be such a helpful approach.
Yes. I often go in as a chaplain in the hospital after the families have left. I often go back into the room and shut the door and talk to the soul that I assume might still be there and tell them to look for the light. Just to, it's a mini Bardo instruction, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you suppose, Nancy, if these were individually designed mystical experiences, and not to say something deeply theological, when you have either a dNDE or an NDE, do you suppose if it were accepted that way that so many of the organized religions that just like to reject NDEs out of hand might be more willing to take a look at the importance of the NDE for as a personal mystical experience?
I think that would have the potential to be really helpful. The question that comes immediately to mind is, for some faith traditions, they're so locked into the idea that there is only one right way. I don't know if they could learn enough flexibility to allow the idea that God works in more than one way. I think it would be great if they could do that. But
there's so much material within each congregation. There are often people who've had near-death experiences. And they sit there silently in the pews, never sharing it with anyone because they're either embarrassed or they think it's contradictory to what the pastor believes. And
they think it's satanic because it doesn't quote Jesus the way they expect it would quote Jesus.
Right. And yet there's a pastor. I interviewed him a few shows back, who chose to, starting with Easter, preached 5 Sunday sermons on near-death experience, complete with
marvelous.
Complete with clips, movie clips that he showed during the service of people talking about their NDEs. I got to go to 2 of these services. It was out in Arizona, and I just happened to be out there for 2 of those 5 Sundays. And it was terrific. And he said afterwards, talking to me, people came up to me and told me stories I would never have heard about their own NDEs. And
soon as
some
people have the okay to share.
Yeah, and when they shared with the congregation itself, I think one person was willing to do that. It made such a powerful impression that this was not just some far off crazy idea, but that people they knew and loved were actually telling them what had happened to them. And if that could happen in churches, around the world, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., what a difference it would make in our perception of the afterlife.
Lee, I have been talking, as you know, I have been speaking in churches for now 30-some years about NDEs. I have never yet spoken to a church group where somebody did not, at least one person, sometimes 3 or even more, have come up afterwards. Usually they're crying, saying, I have never been able to tell anybody about this. So our churches are full of people who have had these kinds of experiences, pleasant ones, scary ones, disturbing ones. But unless they're given permission, is what it often feels like. Yes, this is normal. Yes, God loves you with or without an NDE. yes, the fact that you've had a frightening experience does not mean that God has thrown you out. It just means you've got some work to do.
Yes.
It's amazingly powerful.
When we had our first conversation on air about this in 2013, we talked a little about, and I hope people go back and listen to this because it's archived on the website, about how you can help people reconcile their NDE experience with their faith experience, with their church practice. Often they can make both work together to do what needs to be done. And I don't really have a question about that because we've already talked about it, but it just seems to me that churches should not feel threatened by the NDE experience.
You know, it's like so many other things. We have our own ideas of how God works, and those are our ideas. They're not necessarily God's ideas of how God works. Mm. And if we can just learn, oh goodness me, it's kind of like the current hoo-ha going around about transgender bathrooms. If God says that some children are born with ambiguous genitalia and you can't really tell a definitive sex right off the bat, who are we to argue with this? Who are we to say that we know more than God does? And I feel this so strongly about NDEs and the way so many people have to struggle to say, I didn't make this up. I didn't ask for this. Can somebody help me figure out what this means to me?
I've always thought of...
Go.
I was going to say, I've always thought of NDEs as a gift. Transgender problems, I tend to think of as possibly something we have created ourselves by polluting the environments with estrogen-like chemicals and so forth, so that at some point in the development of the fetus, something has happened, which has changed what, might normally be a boy or a girl in their psychological makeup, as well as possibly their physical makeup. And that we've done this, that we have really inflicted this on ourselves, that we see, salamanders and toads and other animals in nature now being born with what we would call deformities in the animal. And these are possibly the same situation in our transgender kids. It's not their fault, and we have to make all sorts of accommodations for what we've done to them. But I think maybe we've inflicted that on them ourselves.
Well, in any event, we know there are things which happen that we cannot adequately explain.
Yes.
NDE's being at the top of our list for this half hour. And I just hope that people who are kind of held in a really rigid theological structure that says that it's wrong for them to have had such an experience if it doesn't accord to a certain set of man-made interpretations. I just hope they find a way to be whole, because they certainly can be.
Yes.
Even if the initial experience is extremely difficult. The wholeness just takes time.
Someone in my church congregation on Sunday said that she'd read somewhere or heard from a friend that the best way to deal with something that's bad, like, getting cancer, for example, is to thank God for it. It seems, totally crazy, but she said she's taken to doing this, thanking God for things that have been real setbacks, and she finds they straighten themselves out in remarkable ways.
Yes.
And so even a dNDE can be a blessing if you choose to think of it that way.
Eventually they can be. It's important not to be too glib about that, but it's absolutely true. And people are finding this about people who've had early heart attacks, people who've had cancer, all kinds of seemingly disastrous experiences, out of which they emerge with greater compassion, with greater love, with greater desire to help other people. In other words, the same effects as a beautiful NDE has for another group of folks.
Yes.
The bottom line is universal, and that is that when you boil everything down, it's love, it's being compassionate and helpful towards other people. It usually says, what did you learn? So it's love, learning, service.
Yes.
I think it's so cool that Jesus came to the same conclusion. Love God.
Yes.
Love your neighbor.
Yes. In the 2 minutes we have left, Nancy, tell us about your new book.
Thank you for asking. The new book is titled The Buddha in Hell and Other Alarms, subtitled Distressing Near-Death Experiences in Perspective. The first book, Dancing Past the Dark, is really an extended description and discussion of what are these experiences. This book is based on 4 years of blog posts and years of conference presentations and other articles, that the theme of it being, how can we make sense of these distressing experiences, particularly the hellish ones? The fact that a person, and it's a genuine Burmese monk who had an NDE and saw the Buddha in hell. So the question is, how can we make sense of things that seem to make no sense? And that's the overall theme. And the book itself is, it's not nearly as data-packed as the first book was. It's much more conversational. It's just essays.
Neat.
About what it is the conversation that my blog readers and I have been having over the past 4 years.
Oh, and mention quickly, if you would, how they can find your blog.
They can. The blog is Dancing Past the Dark, all one word. And I know it looks funny when you see it printed, but too late.
And is that's .com?
DancingPastTheDark.com. Or if you just Google my name, Nancy Evans Bush,
Great. Nancy, thank you so much for doing the show. Let me tell the audience that if they'd like to listen to it again or any of our previous programs, and I'd suggest you check out both of those done with Nancy, please visit our website at nderadio.org. For more information about IANDS and the upcoming July conference in Orlando, Florida, go to iands.org. And I know Nancy's going to be there, and I would look forward to seeing you there as well. Thanks for listening.
Thanks